Well, his reputation was capped in the 1927 Mississippi flood, which was the greatest natural disaster in American history. There was no FEMA. There was no Brownie to do a heck of a job. What there was Herbert Hoover. And he left Washington, he went out into the field and almost single-handedly cobbled together a massive and, by the way, integrated relief response, working with the Red Cross. So in 1928, he is really the inevitable choice. People in America in 1928 said, "Who but Hoover?" And it was a question that answered itself. He was going to be a very activist kind of president, a Theodore Roosevelt, if you will. His first months in office were a whirlwind of reform. The New Republic said that not since Woodrow Wilson had so decisive a leader set the nation's priorities. Within the first month, he announced an expansion of civil service protection throughout the federal establishment. He canceled private oil leases on government lands, remember Teapot Dome? He issued an executive order opening to the public records of substantial tax refunds. He directed federal law enforcement officials to focus their efforts on gangster-ridden Chicago, where Al Capone held sway, announced plans for a White House conference on children's health, and directed one of his assistants to gather information on how to reorganize all 10 of the government's major departments. Children were close to his heart long before it takes a village. In the 1920s, Americans celebrated every May 1st as Child Health Day because of the National Child Health Association founded by Herbert Hoover. Planning for the future was a Hoover fetish. His Bureau of Reclamation prepared blueprints for a series of dams on the Tennessee Valley and in Central California, forerunner of the TVA. The president invited a citizens committee to examine the question of a new federal Department of Education, 50 years before Jimmy Carter established that body. In September 1929, he met with insurance executives and asked for their cooperation in devising old age pensions, the first step toward his plan to pay every American above the age of 65 $50 a month. 3 months later, he asked Capitol Hill for a federal power commission, federal subsidies to county health units, a rural child health program, and reform of railroad rates and the banking system. He undertook a $5 billion program to overhaul federal prisons, no more would they resemble Dickensian hovels. The new facility at Lewisburg, Pennsylvania, with its own chapel and modern library, reflected his taste for humane treatment and rehabilitation. Not surprisingly, Washington's less standardized sorts didn't know what to make of a chief executive who played medicine ball each morning on the White House lawn because it provided him with exactly 3 times as much exercise as tennis and 6 times as much as golf, who wolfed down 5 courses of a state dinner in 11 minutes and gave signals to eliminate a course if the meal ran over an hour. Then came Black Tuesday, October 29th, when Wall Street collapsed. In a single day, 16 million shares were traded, that was a record at the time, and $30 billion vanished into thin air. Westinghouse lost 2/3 of its value. DuPont dropped 70 points in a day. The era of get rich quick was over. Jack Dempsey, America's first millionaire athlete, lost $3 million on Black Tuesday. Cynical New York hotel clerks asked incoming guests, "You want a room for sleeping or for jumping?" True to form, Hoover's response to the crash combined vigor with restraint. Up until this time, remember, it was assumed that boom and bust was divinely ordained. There was nothing the government could do. You basically had to take your medicine and wait for the economic cycle to correct itself. Hoover did not believe that. First of all, he appealed to all the nation's governors to accelerate public works projects in their states. He organized a conference in January 1930 to convince the public that times were ripe for home building. Later that year, the President's Emergency Committee for Employment was created with 3,000 local chapters to coordinate grassroots relief and exhort Americans to lift themselves by their bootstraps. He created a federal farm board to cushion wheat and cotton prices. As the initial recession, and that's what it was, for several months it was a recession, not a depression. By late 1930, things were really beginning to turn serious. Joblessness soared to record levels. Hoover expanded government's role far beyond the hands-off stance taken in earlier depressions. In fact, believe it or not, they coined the word depression because they thought that was less depressing than the usual word slump. There's a bit of public relations gone bad. In April 1930, he secured $150 million, which, remember, you have to remember, this time the federal budget was about $3 billion. $150 million, that's 5% of the federal budget, a significant amount of money, for his own crash public works program. He added 37,000 miles of highway. He threw a double-deck span of steel and cable across San Francisco's Golden Gate. He created federal land banks to halt farm foreclosures and home loan discount banks to afford homeowners similar protection. He launched the National Credit Association with $500 million in capital and sent it out into the field to salvage tottering banks. But in the first month alone, 522 financial institutions went under and the program died a mourning. He cut federal salaries by 15%. He never took a salary himself. Herbert Hoover is one of two American presidents, John Kennedy being the other, who did not accept his salary. In Hoover's case, he never took a dime for any of his public service. He said this country had given him so much that it was the least he could do to pay it back. He persuaded the Interstate Commerce Commission to reduce rates on rail lines carrying water and forage to desperate farmers. Remember, by this time, the Dust Bowl has arrived to multiply the tragedy. He unveiled the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, funded with $3 billion to ransom financial institutions in the throes of deflation and the depositors' panic. He violated the gospel of balanced budgets, and at the time it was considered incredibly radical. He actually called for a moratorium on the payment of Europe's war debts. Now, in the meantime, he had done something for which economists and others have still not forgiven him. He signed what's called the Smoot-Hawley Tariff, which had the effect of raising protectionist barriers around the American economy. And of course, that set off a chain reaction. I mean, it was the worst thing that could have been done under the circumstances. He did, however, remain adamant in one thing. He was adamant in opposing direct relief payments to individual Americans. The electorate then and history since has been unkind, but Hoover was unmoved. A little collectivism, he would observe, was like a little strychnine in a glass of milk. By contrast, quote, a voluntary deed is infinitely more precious to our national ideas and spirit than 1,000-fold poured from the treasury. It's easy to criticize, but believe it or not, this was grounded in those same ideals. Hoover believed that what set America apart from every other country in the world was this spirit of voluntarism, you know, what de Tocqueville talked about in the 19th century, and this sense of neighborly generosity. That if there was a crisis, you could go to the American people, whatever it was, and they would respond. The problem with that, and when I say it became a ball and chain, that's the idea that raised him to the White House. The problem, of course, was that nothing had ever begun to measure up to the dimensions of the Great Depression. It was beyond individual or grassroots generosity, as we now know.